April 8th, 1943, 27,000 feet above France. Behind an oxygen mask, a German ace can't hide his smirk. Below him, 16 brand new American fighters struggle upward. Barrel-shaped bodies, wings that look too small, landing gear like steel stilts. To German eyes, they look ridiculous. He keys his radio, flying milk bottles. Laughter crackles across the Luftwaffe frequency. What he didn't know, what none of them could imagine, was that the sound of those milk bottles would soon become the thunder that silenced the skies of Europe. June 1940. France falls. German fighters sweep the skies. The U.S. Army Air Corps issues a desperate order: build us a high-altitude interceptor fast enough to face the Luftwaffe, tough enough to win. At Republic Aviation, a Georgian-born immigrant named Alexander Kartveli studies the request, and then ignores it. What he sketches instead is something no one asked for: a monster. It will be a dinosaur, Kartveli admits to his team, but a dinosaur with good proportions. May 6, 1941. The P-47B lifts into the sky for the very first time. At 9,900 pounds, empty 65% heavier than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer, it is the largest, heaviest single-engine fighter the world has ever seen. Test pilots stare at it and ask the same question. This thing actually flies. Not only did it fly, it flew like nothing else at altitude. The secret was the turbo supercharger. Fed by exhaust gases, it delivered sea-level power in the stratosphere where German engines gasped for air. At 27,000 feet, where a Messerschmitt's climb faltered, the Jug's double wasp kept roaring, 18 cylinders pounding like a locomotive chained to wings. This was not a European Predator, sleek, optimized for tight turns. This was something else. A flying sledgehammer, built the American way, heavy, overpowered, designed to absorb punishment and throw it back tenfold. To many, it looked absurd, too big, too heavy, too clumsy. But what Kartveli had built was more than a fighter. It was a statement that in modern war, survivability and firepower would matter more than elegance. And soon, this ugly dinosaur would prove unstoppable. But before the Thunderbolt could face the Luftwaffe, it had to survive its own training fields. Between September 1942 and January 1943, the 56th Fighter Group alone lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft, not to German fire, but to the Jug itself. On takeoff, its massive torque could flip an unwary pilot. On landing, a careless rudder touch sent it cartwheeling across the runway. And in a dive, pilots discovered something terrifying: compressibility. Shockwaves formed on the wings. Controls froze solid. Many never pulled out. The P-47 killed more Americans in training than Germans would in its first months of combat. But those who mastered it discovered something extraordinary. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, farm boy from Oklahoma, remembered his first flight. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. For those who could tame it, the Jug revealed its true nature: not a dancer, but a brawler. 8 heavy machine guns, 3,400 rounds, 30 seconds of sustained fire, an eternity in aerial combat. The lesson was brutal but clear. The P-47 wasn't built to turn. It wasn't built to glide. It was built to aim and annihilate. Spring 1943. The Thunderbolt finally meets the Luftwaffe over occupied France. The result, embarrassing. In turning fights, Messerschmitts danced circles around the Jug. Focke-Wulfs slashed from below where the big Americans struggled to climb. The first month of combat told a brutal story. 14 Thunderbolts lost, for just 3 German kills. Oberleutnant Josef Pips. Priller of JG-26 reported, "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck turns, like a freight train, climbs like a pregnant cow." British observers were no kinder. Watching from their nimble Spitfires, they joked, the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 unstrap and run around the cockpit. And yet, something strange was happening. The Jugs that did go down had taken punishment no other fighter could endure. One returned on May 4th with 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun strikes. Damage that would have shattered a Spitfire or Messerschmitt, but the Thunderbolt flew home. Its air-cooled radial engine shrugged off hits that would have killed a liquid-cooled fighter. Its armor plating kept pilots alive. To the Germans, the Jug looked like a clumsy joke. To the Americans flying it, it was revealing a secret that brute strength could buy survival. And survival in air combat meant something priceless, the chance to fight again tomorrow. June 26, 1943. Robert S. Johnson's Thunderbolt takes the full fury of JG-26. 20 20mm shells rip through the jug. The canopy track is welded shut by an explosion trapping him inside a burning coffin. Oil sprays across the windscreen. The instrument panel erupts in fire. Control cables hang in tatters. Any other fighter would already be falling in pieces. A lone Focke-Wulf lines up behind him. 4 20mm cannon, 2 machine guns. He empties them all into Johnson's crippled jug. Still, it flies. The German pulls alongside, stares in disbelief. Young blonde, his eyes widen. He shakes his head, gives a small salute, and peels away, out of ammunition. Johnson staggered from the cockpit, bleeding but alive. His Thunderbolt carried more than 200 holes. One 20mm shell had exploded inches from his head. 3 of the 4 main fuselage longerons were severed. The engine, torn and battered, still brought him home. To the Americans, it was revelation. To the Germans, it was shock. The jug wasn't just a fighter. It was a fortress with wings. Survivability like this had never been seen before. Spitfires, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs could be beautiful, could be deadly, but none could take such punishment and keep flying. The Germans had mocked the Thunderbolt as a flying milk bottle. Johnson's return proved the truth. This was a beast that simply refused to die. What made the P-47's firepower terrifying wasn't a single cannon blast. It was the geometry of 8 guns working as one. Imagine 8 streams of lead forming a cone in front of the target. At the chosen convergence distance, typically about 300 yards, those trajectories cross in a tight volume, a lethal sphere of fire. The math is brutal and simple. 8 guns, 425 rounds per gun, a combined rate of fire near 6,000 rounds per minute. That's 750 rounds per minute per gun, 12.5 rounds per second each. At that rate, a single gun's 425 rounds will last roughly 34 seconds of continuous fire. Put all 8 together, and you have a sustained torrent 3,400 rounds, about 34 seconds of wall-to-wall lead. The ammunition mix mattered armor-piercing incendiary API, API tracer API-T, and ball rounds. The US .50 caliber used delayed action fuses and incendiary fillers designed to penetrate and then burn temperatures in the thousands of degrees on impact. In practice, the 8-gun battery created what gunners called a probability cloud, a high-density volume where even with imperfect aim hits were virtually guaranteed. Compare that to a few 20mm cannon rounds they hit hard, but carry limited ammunition, maybe 120, 200 rounds total, and only for brief bursts. Fire long enough from a jug, and that probability cloud will do to an aircraft what a few 20mm rounds could not break it apart. That's the secret behind the wall of lead. Not elegance, not finesse, but sustained concentrated probability, a cloud of metal that, given time, turns a fighter into confetti. When P-47 pilots learned to use altitude dive energy and converge their fire at the right distance, they didn't need finesse to win. They needed patience, discipline, and the willingness to let 3,400 rounds speak for them. August 17, 1943. The deep penetration raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the heaviest gamble yet of the daylight bombing campaign. B-17 formations lumbered toward their targets, each carrying tons of bombs meant to cripple German industry. Waiting for them, swarms of Bf-110 destroyers, twin-engine killers armed with heavy cannon and rockets designed to tear bombers apart. But this time, the jugs were waiting too. A Thunderbolt carried 425 rounds per gun. 8 guns meant 3,400 rounds total, nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. At 300 yards, their ballistic paths crossed in a kill zone just 6 feet wide. Inside that zone, the effect wasn't a shoot-down. It was dismemberment. Survivors said, "They didn't shoot us down. They cut us apart." In less than a minute, P-47s tore through entire formations of Bf-110s. Crews recalled wing-severed tails blown clear off fuselages, shredded into metallic confetti. This was the Thunderbolt turkey shoot, but for twin-engine fighters meant to massacre bombers. Against 8 Brownings firing at nearly 6,000 rounds per minute, combined the Luftwaffe's heavy fighters never stood a chance. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raids were costly. Many bombers never made it home. But the Thunderbolt proved something vital that day, when the jug's guns spoke nothing and the Luftwaffe's arsenal could survive the storm. From then on, German pilots no longer saw the Jug as a joke. They saw it for what it was, a flying hammer, built to smash anything in its path. By early 1944, the Jug itself began to change. The P-47D-22 introduced a paddle blade propeller nearly 13 feet across. With its broad cord blades biting the air like giant oars, the Jug's climb rate jumped from 2,200 to nearly 3,000 feet per minute. Along with the new bubble canopy and external fuel tanks, the P-47D became the workhorse of the air war, a long-legged bruiser that could finally stretch deeper into enemy skies. Then came the P-47M. Stripped for speed, tuned for interception, it could push 470 miles per hour at altitude. This was the Jug built for emergencies, to chase down V-1 flying bombs, screaming toward London, and even to hunt the new terror of the skies, the Me-262 jet fighter. Against jets, no propeller plane should have stood a chance. Yet, in a dive, a P-47M could still close the gap, and when its 8 Brownings spoke, jets came apart like paper. In the Pacific Range was everything. The P-47N answered that call. With lengthened wings holding wet fuel tanks and capacity for external drop tanks, it could stretch to nearly 1,600 miles. From island strips on Iwo Jima, the long-legged Thunderbolts escorted B-29s on the final raids over Japan. What had begun as a short-range overweight brawler in 1943 had evolved into a versatile family, a bomber escort, a jet hunter, a ground attack monster. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Over 500 Thunderbolts filled the skies above Normandy. Layer upon layer, from sea level to 30,000 feet, they formed an iron canopy no German pilot could pierce. A Luftwaffe ace later admitted, "You could not climb over them. You could not dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain." The message was clear. The beaches did not belong to the Wehrmacht. The sky belonged to the Jug. For weeks after the landings, the Jug became flying artillery. Against German columns racing to reinforce the front, Thunderbolts unleashed a storm of 50 caliber fire 1,000-pound bombs and 5-inch rockets. By the end of June, the 9th Air Force's Jugs had left behind more than 650 locomotives, 3,800 trucks, and 500 armored vehicles in ruins. The Wehrmacht was forced to move only at night. By day, every road was death row patrolled by the Jug. To the men on the beaches, the sound of that engine was salvation. To the men beneath its guns, it was the sound of annihilation. The Luftwaffe had once laughed at flying milk bottles. On D-Day, those milk bottles became the thunder of liberation. January 1st, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte. In a desperate gamble, the Luftwaffe launched nearly 900 fighters in a surprise strike against Allied airfields. At Y-34 near Metz, 22 Thunderbolts burned on the ground. To German pilots, it looked like victory. A captured officer mocked, "What do you think of that?" The American commander pointed to the flight line. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" Within 48 hours, fresh Jugs were rolling onto the flight line. Republic Aviation could build 1 Thunderbolt every hour. Evansville, Indiana was turning out 500 per month. On that single day, the Luftwaffe lost 271 aircraft and 213 irreplaceable pilots. The Americans lost 134 planes total and replaced everyone within a week. The battle wasn't decided in the skies above Metz. It was decided in the factories of America. In the end, it wasn't just tactics or bravery that buried the Luftwaffe. It was logistics. It was industry. The Jug was not just an airplane. It was America's answer to the question of total war. And that answer came in steel, fire, and thunder. In Italy, the Jug became the hammer that smashed supply lines. At Anzio, Thunderbolts ripped apart German convoys, cutting lifelines before they could reach the beachhead. In the Ardennes, winter turned the battlefield into mud and ice. Panzer divisions clawed forward through the snow until the Jugs arrived. Rockets screamed, 50s thundered, and panzers burned. Infantry who once feared tank treads now looked skyward, knowing the Jug would be their armored fist from above. By war's end, Thunderbolts had destroyed more than 86,000 vehicles and over 9,000 locomotives, the most lethal ground attack record of any Allied fighter. In the Pacific Range meant survival. Islands stretched across oceans, and every mile was a battlefield. The P-47N was built for this theater Longer wings, greater fuel, able to fly nearly 1,600 miles to escort the B-29 Superfortress. From Leyte to Okinawa, Jugs became both escort and executioner. Against Japanese ships and airfields, Thunderbolts unleashed 5-inch rockets and 1,000-pound bombs, torching aircraft, cratering runways, and silencing guns. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai admitted, "We called them monsters. Our 20 mm cannon was like a mosquito bite. I put dozens of rounds into one Jug, and it kept flying." The Jug, that once struggled for altitude over France, now ruled the endless skies of the Pacific. It was proof that the Thunderbolt was not just a European brawler, but a global war machine, as feared in Tokyo as it was in Berlin. Late in the war, the Luftwaffe unleashed its final weapon, the Me-262 jet fighter, faster than anything with a propeller in theory untouchable. But the Jug still had a window. From 30,000 feet, it could dive at over 550 miles per hour. In those seconds of fury, even a jet could be caught. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer proved it diving from altitude closing to 400 yards and cutting a jet apart with 8 Brownings. The lesson was brutal speed alone did not guarantee survival. Against the Jug's wall of fire, even the future of aviation could bleed. The Jug had begun as a laughingstock, a flying milk bottle. By 1945, it had proven something far greater, that mass power and fire could bend even the jet age. The Thunderbolt was not just a fighter. It was America's hammer, smashing enemies from the hedgerows of France to the jungles of the Pacific, to the frozen skies where jets first roared. In April 1943, German pilots laughed. They saw flying milk bottles lumbering through the sky. 2 years later, the laughter was gone. Gun cameras showed Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts ripped apart in seconds, victims of 8 Brownings speaking in unison. At Dayton today, a Jug still stands beside a strip of gun film beside spent .50 cal shells, silent artifacts that once spoke louder than thunder. Even Germany's greatest aces admitted the truth. Gallant Prillermen, who had mocked the Jug, later called it the best fighter-bomber of the war. The Americans did not win with elegance. They won with production, with training, with firepower, and with survivability. The Jug embodied all of it. A machine that could take punishment and still bring its pilot home. Decades later, another Thunderbolt took to the skies the A-10 Warthog, heavily armored, pilot protected, a flying hammer with devastating guns. The name was no accident. The philosophy of the Jug never died: survivability, protection, overwhelming firepower. From milk bottle to thunderclap to the roar of the Warthog, the sky remembers. And so does history.